Human resource called me the settlement operations manager. I called myself the woman standing between a billion-dollar fintech company and the kind of shutdown that makes investors stop smiling in boardrooms. On paper, I reviewed payment files, vendor approvals, bank confirmations, compliance checklists, and transaction exception reports. Very glamorous work, especially if your idea of glamour is sitting under fluorescent lights at 9:47 p.m., explaining to a 28-year-old vice president why almost reconciled is not a financial term. But in reality, I knew which sponsor bank could freeze our processing line, which insurance clause could void our coverage, which client file could trigger a regulatory review, and which executive signature had been copied so many times that half the leadership team had forgotten what authority actually meant. The company was called Vatrix Global Pay. We processed payment infrastructure for payroll platforms, online lenders, subscription companies, small business finance apps, and a few flashy brands whose CEOs liked saying things like, "We're disrupting money movement," while not knowing where the money actually moved. At our peak, Vatrix handled close to $2.8 billion a month in transactions, and somehow, the people upstairs convinced themselves that the system worked because of their strategy decks, their rooftop investor dinners, and their expensive rebrand with a logo that looked like a bent paperclip. It didn't. It worked because I had spent 9 years remembering every single promise they had made to banks, vendors, auditors, insurers, clients, regulators, and one very unpleasant compliance attorney named Martin who could smell missing paperwork through a locked PDF. Then I had surgery. And while I was still moving slowly, still sleeping upright, still measuring my day in pain medication and doctor's instructions, the new CEO decided I was no longer part of the future culture. That was the phrase. Future culture. Not "thank you for keeping this company alive," not "take the time you need to recover," not even "we found someone better." Just future culture. Before I tell you how one arrogant decision turned a fintech darling into a case study with emergency board minutes. Hit subscribe if you enjoy watching corporate karma arrive wearing reading glasses and carrying a compliance binder. Because I did not sabotage Vatrix Pay. I did not delete files. I did not leak secrets. I did not call competitors in the dark like some villain in a bad streaming drama. I simply stopped being the invisible bridge they had been driving trucks over for 9 years. And the day they removed me, the bridge became their problem. When I joined Vatrix Pay, it was not called Vatrix Pay. It was called P-Gate Processing, which sounded like a company that sold printer cartridges to local banks. There were 32 employees, 1 sponsor bank relationship, 3 major clients, and an office kitchen where the refrigerator made a noise like a dying lawnmower. I was hired as an operations analyst. That title meant I did whatever no one else understood well enough to assign properly. Failed transaction batch? Send it to Naomi. Client says funds are missing? Send it to Naomi. Sponsor bank wants a quarterly exception report formatted according to a template last updated during the Obama administration. Send it to Naomi. Auditor asking why the approval trail on a vendor migration had 2 timestamps and 1 missing initials field? Definitely send it to Naomi, preferably after offering coffee and a small apology to heaven. I was 39 then. Not old, but old enough in fintech years to be treated like a historical artifact. Most of the employees were younger than me, brilliant in the way people are brilliant when they have never watched a payment file fail at 4:59 p.m. on a Friday before a holiday weekend. They loved dashboards. I loved evidence.oo. They loved automated workflows. I loved asking, and what happens when the workflow breaks? That question made people uncomfortable. It also saved the company several times. The first time was during a payroll platform onboarding for a client called Pillar Wage. Pillar Wage processed same-day payroll for hourly workers across restaurant chains. Their CEO wanted to launch fast because he had promised investors a growth milestone he had no business promising. The sales team said we could onboard them in 10 days. I said no. The head of sales smiled at me like I had just asked to pay with a check. "Naomi," he said, "we can't let operations slow revenue." I looked at the file. The client's customer authorization language was incomplete. Their funding reserve math was weak. Their bank account validation process was too loose, and the failure thresholds in their service agreement were written like someone had copied them from a blog post titled "How to Sound Financial." I delayed the launch. Sales complained, the founder complained, Pillar Wage complained, Then, 3 weeks later, one of Pillar Wage's restaurant chains submitted a payroll file with duplicate entries for nearly 6,000 employees. If we had launched on the original date, we would have sent millions in duplicate payroll deposits and spent the weekend clawing money back from line cooks, servers, and shift managers who had done nothing wrong except work for a messy employer. Instead, the control I insisted on caught it. The head of sales never apologized. He did, however, stop making eye contact with me near the coffee machine. But that became a pattern. I would identify the risk. Someone would call me negative. The risk would become real. I would fix it. Then everyone would agree that the system worked beautifully. No one ever said, Naomi was right. They said, good thing we had a process. I was the process. Not alone, of course. There were smart people across the company. I had analysts who could read transaction anomalies like weather patterns. I had 2 compliance coordinators who were worth more than half the executives. I had a quiet reconciliation specialist named Eli who could find a 12-cent discrepancy inside $20 million faster than most people could find their car keys. But I was the one who knew how it all connected. Payment operations, sponsor bank covenants, client approval chains, vendor redundancy requirements, bearer transaction monitoring thresholds, insurance reporting windows, board disclosure rules, the dreaded shutdown review protocol. That last one mattered more than anyone upstairs realized. When Vatrix grew, we stopped being cute. Cute companies get flexible partners. Big companies get documents. By year 4, we had 3 sponsor banks, 2 payment networks, a cybersecurity insurance carrier, a major cloud vendor, an external compliance firm, and a board that had started using words like enterprise maturity while still asking me to explain why settlement files could not be approved over text message. One sponsor bank in particular, Havenford National, became the backbone of our highest volume transaction line. Havenford was conservative, painfully conservative. Their due diligence checklist was 93 pages long. And I'm convinced page 72 existed only to test whether applicants still had the will to live. They didn't trust fintech companies by default. Smart bank. During our original Havenford review, they asked who owned daily settlement integrity, exception escalation, vendor continuity, and emergency authorization if leadership was unavailable. Our executives wanted to list the chief operating officer. The COO at the time was a charismatic man named Russell who thought ACH returns were more of a back office vibe. I told them no, Havenford wanted a real operational owner, not a title with a haircut. So after 3 weeks of meetings, document revisions, uncomfortable conversations, and one board call where Russell said, "Oh, Naomi is being dramatic." Havenford named me as the certified operations continuity officer for that transaction line. It sounded grand. It was mostly paperwork. But the paperwork had teeth. The agreement said if I was removed, replaced, became unavailable, or was no longer authorized to certify operational continuity, Vatrix had to notify Havenford within 1 business day and submit a qualified replacement for review before processing volume could continue without restrictions. There were reasons for that. I certified daily controls. I approved emergency vendor routing. I verified settlement exceptions. I signed the monthly operational attestation tied to our insurance coverage. I maintained the audit trail that proved we were not just throwing billions of dollars through an API and hoping the universe stayed polite. For years, then I told leadership, you need to cross-train a proper deputy. They nodded. They agreed. They scheduled meetings. They rescheduled meetings. Then they hired a brand consultant. That was Vatrix. A company could ignore structural risk forever, as long as the slide deck had gradient colors. The first CEO, Adrian Vale, was flawed but not stupid. He was a founder, which meant he had the emotional stability of a weather app during hurricane season. But he respected institutional knowledge when it saved him money. He used to call me the smoke alarm. Not flattering, but accurate. When something smelled wrong, I made noise. Adrian would complain, argue, pace, accuse me of being too cautious, then eventually listen. That changed when the investors pushed him into an executive chairman role and brought in Camden Rourke. But Camden arrived with a press release, a profile in a business magazine, and the kind of smile men practice before saying difficult decisions. He was 34, former strategy director at a payment-adjacent startup that sold for a lot of money before anyone asked whether it was profitable. He wore white sneakers with suits and used the phrase operational drag to describe departments that prevented lawsuits. His first all-hands meeting was held in a rented event space with black walls, neon lighting, and a DJ who looked just as confused as the rest of us. Camden stood on stage beneath a glowing Vatrix logo and said, "We are no longer a back-office company. We are a movement." I whispered to Eli, "Movements still need reconciliation." Eli coughed into his hand to hide laughing. Camden talked for 40 minutes. He talked about speed. He talked about culture. He talked about founder energy, even though the actual founder was sitting in the front row looking like a man watching someone else redecorate his childhood home. Then Camden said the sentence that told me exactly what kind of trouble we were in. "Complexity is often just fear wearing a process costume." The room applauded. I did not. Because in payments, complexity is not fear. Complexity is what keeps a teacher's paycheck from landing in the wrong account because someone skipped verification to hit a launch date. After the all-hands, Camden began his listening tour. Except he did not listen. He visited departments, asked polished questions, nodded at answers, and then summarized everything back incorrectly. When he reached operations, I had prepared a risk map, not because I was trying to impress him, because I wanted him to understand where the pressure points were before he started pushing buttons. The map showed our sponsor bank dependencies, critical approval chains, vendor failover gaps, client volume concentration, outstanding audit commitments, and the leadership actions required before our Havenford annual review. Camden looked at the first page and smiled. "This is very thorough," he said. "That is executive language for 'I will never read this.'" I said, "The Havenford review is in 8 weeks. We need to confirm backup certification authority, finalize the exception remediation log, and correct the client reserve disclosures for 3 high-volume accounts." Camden leaned back in his chair. "How much of this is legally required versus Naomi required?" The room went quiet. My director, Marianne, looked down at her notebook. Yet Marianne was decent but allergic to conflict. She had survived at Vatrix by becoming a human cushion between executives and consequences. Unfortunately, cushions do not stop trains. I said, "Havenford requires operational continuity certification. Our agreement requires immediate notice if I am no longer authorized. The insurance carrier relies on the same monthly attestation. The board risk committee asked for confirmation last quarter." Camden tapped his pen once. "Right. But could the system run without you?" That question should have been innocent. It wasn't. It had a blade in it. I said, "For a day, yes. For a week, poorly. Through a sponsor bank review, an insurance renewal, and a client volume spike without a qualified deputy? No." Camden smiled again. "See, I think that's the kind of culture I want to move away from. Accuracy. Single points of failure." I almost respected that answer. Almost, because he was right in theory. No company should depend on one person. I had said that for years. I had begged them to fix it. But there is a difference between removing a single point of failure and pretending it does not exist because admitting it would be inconvenient. I said, "Then we should train and certify a deputy immediately." Camden stood up. "Good. Marianne, let's modernize this. I want a cleaner model. Less tribal knowledge, more platform thinking." Platform thinking. That was the second red flag. The third was when he assigned the project to Bree Caldwell. Bree had been at Vatrix for 11 months. She was smart, ambitious, and been very good at making executives feel like their vague ideas were visionary. Her title was Senior Transformation Lead, which meant she attended meetings about work other people were doing and turned their stress into colorful diagrams. Bree had never managed settlement exceptions. She had never spoken to Havenford without me on the call. She once asked whether a client reserve balance could be smoothed visually for a board deck, but Camden liked her. She laughed at his jokes before he finished them. That is a skill, not a useful one in payment operations, but apparently very useful near power. Within 2 weeks, Bree had renamed my risk map. She called it the Operational Velocity Framework. Nothing changed except the font. Then she scheduled a workshop titled Denaomifying Continuity. I wish I were making that up. The calendar invite landed in my inbox at 7:12 a.m. I stared at it while drinking tea at my desk. Eli walked by, saw my face, and said, "Do I want to know?" I turned the laptop toward him. He read the title. His eyebrows disappeared into his hairline. "Wow," he said. "They made disrespect sound like a software update." The workshop was exactly what you think it was. Bree stood in front of a glass wall covered in sticky notes and said, "We want to move away from legacy dependency models." I asked, "Who is we?" She blinked. "The leadership team." I looked at Marianne. Marianne suddenly became fascinated by her water bottle. Bree continued, "Naomi, you've done incredible work, truly. But a lot of your methods are very manual. They are documented." "Right. But they live in documents. That is where documentation traditionally lives." A few people laughed quietly. Bree did not. She clicked to a slide showing a simplified transaction flow. It was missing 2 sponsor bank approval points, the vendor failover trigger, the insurance notification window, and the client reserve exception gate. I raised my hand. Bree smiled tightly. "You don't need to raise your hand, Naomi." "I know. I'm giving this slide a moment to prepare itself." More quiet laughter. Camden, who had joined by video from some hotel lobby, said, "Let's keep this constructive." I said, "Constructive is exactly what I'm doing. This flow is missing the controls that prevent restricted funds from being released before exception clearance." Bree said, "No, we're trying not to overcomplicate." "And I'm trying not to commit negligence with arrows." The meeting ended with Camden asking me to send Bree all relevant historical context. Historical context, 9 years of negotiated controls, audit commitments, sponsor bank conditions, client exceptions, risk escalations, and emergency workarounds, reduced to something that sounded like a family recipe. I sent her everything. Not because I liked it, because I was still responsible. That was the exhausting thing about being me at Vatrix. They could insult the work all day, but if the building caught fire, they still expected me to know where the exits were. 3 weeks before the Havenford review, I had surgery. It was not dramatic in the way movies understand dramatic. No ambulance, no whispered hospital hallway confession. You're just a procedure I had delayed too long because Vatrix always had one more deadline, one more review, one more client launch, one more executive emergency caused by someone confusing confidence with competence. My doctor had been clear. 2 weeks of rest, limited movement, no long hours, no stress. I laughed when he said no stress. He didn't laugh back. Before I left, I prepared a transition folder so detailed it probably qualified as a hostage negotiation document. Daily settlement checklist, Havenford review calendar, required evidence list, pending exception items, client reserve correction notes, insurance attestation schedule, vendor escalation tree, board risk committee update draft. I walked Bree through it twice. The first time she nodded too quickly. The second time she recorded the call without asking and said, "Maura, this is just to capture your institutional magic." I said, "It's not magic, it's responsibility." She smiled. "Exactly." "No, not exactly. The last thing I said before leave was to Marianne. Do not submit the Havenford pre-review packet without the reserve disclosure correction and the deputy certification explanation." She nodded. "I know." "Marianne." She looked at me. I said, "I need you to actually hear me. If that packet goes in incomplete, Havenford can restrict processing. Not in theory. In writing." She lowered her voice. "Camden wants it sent clean. Clean or incomplete." She didn't answer. That silence followed me into surgery. The procedure went fine. Recovery was slower than I wanted. I was home on my couch with a heating pad, a bottle of water, and the emotional resilience of wet cardboard when the first message came. "More Bree. Quick question. Where is the final continuity narrative?" I stared at the phone. The final continuity narrative was in the folder labeled Final Continuity Narrative. I replied, "Folder 03, Havenford Review. Subfolder B, Do Not Alter Without Legal Review." 10 minutes later, Bree. "Got it. Also, Camden wants to simplify the language around key person continuity. It sounds scary." I closed my eyes. Then I typed, "It is supposed to sound serious because it is serious. Do not soften contractual obligations." No response. That was Wednesday. On Thursday, Marianne called. I let it go to voicemail because I was asleep. The voicemail said, "Hey Naomi, sorry to bother you, but Camden is asking if the Havenford submission absolutely needs your certification section or if Bree can speak to the new model. Call me when you can." I listened to it twice. Then I emailed instead of calling because pain medication and executive panic are a dangerous combination. I wrote, Marianne, do not allow Bree or anyone else to certify operational continuity unless Havenford has accepted that person as authorized. I remain the named Certified Operations Continuity Officer until formally replaced and approved. If leadership intends to remove or replace me, Havenford must be notified within 1 business day. This is not optional. I copied legal. That was when things changed, because when people want to do something careless, they hate witnesses. On Friday, Camden sent me a calendar invite. Subject, alignment conversation. That's how you know something bad is coming. No one has ever aligned someone into a bonus. The meeting was at 4:30 p.m. I joined from my living room, wrapped in a gray blanket, hair pulled back, face pale enough to look like I had been printed in draft mode. Camden was in his office. Bree sat beside him. Marianne was there too, eyes red, shoulders tense. Human resources joined with the expression of someone who had practiced empathy in front of a mirror. Camden began. Naomi, first, we all hope you're recovering well. That sentence told me he did not care if I was recovering well. He continued. We've been evaluating the future of the operations function, and we feel this is the right moment to transition away from legacy dependency. I said nothing. He hated that. People like Camden expect emotion because emotion lets them feel rational. He said, your contributions have been meaningful, but the company is moving into a new phase. We need leaders who align with our speed, collaboration, and modernization goals. I looked at Marianne. She didn't look back. I said, are you terminating my employment while I'm on medical recovery? HR cleared her throat. We are restructuring your role. Into unemployment? Camden's jaw tightened. Bree looked down at her laptop. HR said, your position is being eliminated effective today. We'll provide severance details and transition support. I waited. There are moments when silence does more damage than shouting. Camden filled it. We also need your cooperation in making this transition smooth. Bree will absorb the continuity work temporarily. I said, has Havenford approved Bree as certified continuity officer? Camden sighed. That little sigh, the sigh of a man being inconvenienced by reality. Well, we are not going to let outdated bank language dictate our org design. I nodded slowly. Then you should notify Havenford. Camden leaned forward. Naomi, let's not be difficult. There it was. Difficult. A word often used for women who remember what everyone else signed. I said, I'm not being difficult. I'm being accurate. HR jumped in. You will no longer have system access after this call. We ask that you not contact clients, vendors, banking partners, or employees regarding internal matters. I almost laughed. Almost. Because they wanted to fire the named continuity officer, cut off her access, block her from speaking, and still somehow pretend continuity had continued. I said, you are removing me from authorization today? Camden said, what, yes. And you are instructing me not to act on behalf of Vatrix? Yes. And Bree is not approved by Havenford? He smiled like he had won. Bree is more than capable. I looked directly into the camera. Capability is not authorization. No one spoke. I continued. Once this call ends, I will no longer be legally or operationally authorized to certify continuity for Vatrix pay. Your agreement requires formal notification to Havenford within 1 business day. Your insurance attestation relies on the same designation. Your board risk committee has open reliance on my certification. You should handle that immediately. Camden's face hardened. Are you threatening the company? No, I said. I'm telling you where the floor is before you step off the roof. That was my unforgettable line. Not dramatic, not shouted, just a fact. Camden ended the call 3 minutes later. My laptop access disappeared while HR was still saying they appreciated my service. That was the first domino. I spent the next hour lying on my couch, staring at the ceiling. Not because I was devastated. I was angry, yes. Embarrassed, yes. Hurt more than I wanted to admit. 9 years is a long time to give a company that decides your recovery is a convenient moment to erase you. But beneath all of that, there was a strange calm. Because for once, the emergency was not mine. At 6:02 p.m., I opened my personal email. I did not use company documents. I did not attach confidential files. I did not share client information. I wrote a formal notice based on my own employment status and authorization. To Havenford National Relationship Management, CC, Vatrix Legal. Vatrix Board Risk Committee mailbox, external counsel listed on the continuity agreement. Subject, Notice of Change in Certified Operations, Continuity Authorization. The message was short, professional, painfully polite. I stated that as of that afternoon, Vatrix Pay had terminated my employment and revoked my access. I was therefore no longer authorized to certify operational continuity, approve emergency processing routes, sign monthly control attestations, or represent Vatrix in any capacity related to the Havenford transaction line. I added that under the continuity provisions, any replacement certification should come directly from Vatrix leadership and be reviewed through the appropriate channels. Then I wished them well. That was it. No accusation, no revenge monologue. Want no good luck without me. The most dangerous emails are not emotional. They are precise. I sent a similar notice to the insurance contact for the operational risk policy, again only stating that I was no longer employed, no longer authorized, and could not certify future attestations. Then I turned off my phone and went to sleep. When I woke up at 3:18 a.m., my phone looked like it had tried to escape the table. 16 missed calls, 9 from Marianne, 4 from legal, 2 from a number I recognized as Havenford, 1 from Camden. There were text messages too. Marianne, Naomi, please call me. Marianne, did you notify Havenford? Marianne, Camden is furious. Legal, please contact us immediately regarding your external communications. Camden, this was unnecessary. Then, 6 minutes later, Camden, call me. Then, Camden, we need to resolve this professionally. I put the phone back down. I was still recovering. And for the first time in years, I allowed a Vatrix emergency to remain a Vatrix emergency. By 8 a.m., Havenford had responded. Their message was polite enough to chill the room. They acknowledged my notice and requested immediate confirmation from Vatrix of the approved replacement continuity officer, evidence of transition control, updated authorization matrix, current exception log, reserve disclosure correction, and board acknowledgement of the change. They also stated that pending review, they were placing the high-volume transaction line under restricted operational status. Restricted operational status meant every batch over a certain threshold required manual review before release. It did not shut the company down. Not yet. It just took a system built for speed and forced it to walk through mud. By 9:30 a.m., the first vendor refused to proceed. Not because I called them, because Havenford's restriction triggered an automated dependency notice to Clearframe, our backup reconciliation vendor. Clearframe's contract said they would not assume expanded reconciliation responsibility unless the named continuity officer confirmed the transition path. The named continuity officer was me, and I was no longer authorized. Clearframe paused the expansion. At 10:15 a.m., Pillar Wages' payroll batch hit the restricted threshold. It got held. Pillar Wages' CFO called Vatrix, then called again, then emailed the sponsor bank, then called Camden directly, which I know because Camden left me a voicemail at 10:42 a.m. More with the careful breathing pattern of a man trying not to sound desperate. Naomi, we need clarification on what you sent. Your email has created confusion with Havenford. I understand emotions are high, but this is affecting clients. Call me. I listened while eating toast. Emotions are high? That was cute. My emotions were not holding payroll. Their lack of authorization was. By noon, they realized the problem was bigger than me. The replacement plan failed publicly at 12:37 p.m. Bree joined a Havenford emergency call with Camden, Marianne, Vatrix Legal, and 2 bank officers. I know because Marianne told me later, after everything ended. Havenford asked Bree to walk through the exception escalation path for restricted settlement release. Bree opened the wrong document. Then she described the standard low-risk path. Ms. Havenford asked about high-volume reserve mismatches. Bree said, "We're comfortable managing that dynamically." Havenford asked what dynamically meant in relation to the signed reserve disclosure addendum. Bree said she would circle back. Payment people hate circle back. It is what someone says when they are standing where a bridge should be. Then Havenford asked whether Vatrix had submitted the reserve disclosure correction I had flagged before surgery. Camden said it was in progress. Havenford asked why the pre-review packet had been submitted without it. No one had a good answer. Because the good answer was, Naomi told us not to do that, and we fired her. At 1:06 p.m., Havenford expanded the restriction. Now, batches above a lower threshold required manual review. By 2 p.m., 2 clients had delayed funding releases. By 3:30 p.m., the board risk committee scheduled an emergency meeting. By 4 p.m., Adrian Vale, the founder who had been politely shoved into the wallpaper, called me. I answered. Not because he deserved it, because unlike Camden, Adrian knew when the smoke alarm went off. You didn't argue with the smoke alarm. His voice was tired. Naomi. Adrian. I heard. I assumed. He was quiet for a moment. How bad is it? I don't know. I don't work there anymore. That's fair. Another pause. Then he said, Did you send anything beyond your status change? No. Any files? No. Any client information? No. Any threats? Adrian, I was on pain medication and still managed to behave more responsibly than your CEO. He exhaled. It might have been a laugh. It might have been despair. Can this be fixed? Yes. How? Vatrix needs to appoint a qualified replacement, submit the transition evidence, correct the reserve disclosures, update the authorization matrix, notify the insurance carrier, brief the board, and stop pretending this is about feelings. That sounds like your transition folder. It is. Do they have it? They had it before they fired me. He muttered something I will not repeat because this is a monetization-safe channel and Adrian had a gift for profanity. Then he said, Will you consult? I looked around my living room. The blanket, the water bottle, the prescription bag, the phone that had spent the morning vibrating like a trapped insect. No. Naomi? No. I am not medically cleared. I am not employed. I am not insured under your policy. I am not authorized by your bank. And I am not going to break rules to rescue people who fired me for following them. He said, I understand. And I believed him. That was the difference. Adrian could be selfish, impulsive, difficult, and loud. But when a wall was a wall, he did not call it a window. Camden called me again at 5:11 p.m. I did not answer. He texted, Your refusal to assist may create serious harm. I replied with one sentence. Then involve authorized leadership, external counsel, and Havenford through proper channels. He wrote back almost immediately. We need practical help, not bureaucracy. I smiled, because bureaucracy is what executives call rules after they realize the rules apply to them. The next day, the problem moved from operational to reputational. A client called Civic Nest, which processed subscription billing for municipalities and community service platforms, had a renewal clause tied to Vatrix maintaining uninterrupted sponsor bank processing authority. Havenford's restriction did not automatically terminate the contract, but it triggered a disclosure requirement. Civic Nest's CFO was not amused. Civic Nest paused their renewal. That renewal was worth $18 million over 3 years. More importantly, it was part of Camden's investor narrative. He had been telling everyone Civic Nest proved Vatrix could move into public sector adjacent payments. Investors love phrases like public sector adjacent because they sound stable and expandable without requiring anyone to explain procurement. By 11 a.m., Civic Nest had requested a risk briefing. Bree prepared the briefing. I am told it included the phrase temporary continuity recalibration. Civic Nest's CFO asked whether that meant Vatrix had lost its certified operations continuity officer. No one answered directly. CFOs hate that. They paused all expansion discussions. That was the second domino. The third was the insurance carrier. Our operational risk insurance policy required monthly control attestations from an authorized continuity officer or approved senior officer with documented operational responsibility. For years, that had been me. After my notice, the carrier requested an updated authority chain. Vatrix submitted Camden. The carrier rejected it. Not because Camden was CEO, because the policy language required operational control evidence. Camden had never approved a settlement exception, never signed a daily reconciliation, and never managed a vendor failover, never completed the control certification training required after the last audit. He had, however, given a speech about movement. Apparently, that did not count. The carrier did not cancel coverage. They reserved rights pending review. Reserved rights is a phrase that sounds quiet until you understand. It means we may not pay you if this goes badly. By Friday afternoon, Vatrix had 3 problems: a restricted sponsor bank line, a paused major client renewal, an insurance carrier questioning coverage, all because they fired one legacy dependency and assumed the documents would be too polite to object. Then payroll happened, not internal payroll, client payroll. Pillar Wage had another large batch scheduled Friday evening for Monday release. Because of the restrictions, Vatrix needed manual clearance before release. The batch had a reserve mismatch caused by a client funding delay. Normally, I would have identified the mismatch, escalated it, documented the exception, confirmed funding coverage, notified Pillar Wage, and obtained approval under the sponsor bank's high-volume exception path. Bree tried to handle it. She sent Havenford a summary that described the mismatch as non-material timing variance. Havenford asked for the reserve calculation. Bree sent a screenshot. A screenshot of a dashboard. I felt that disturbance in the universe from my couch. Havenford rejected the clearance. Pillar Wage's payroll release was delayed. No workers lost money permanently. The batch cleared later through a slower process, but the delay created panic among Pillar Wage's clients. Because payroll is not the place where people appreciate fintech innovation. Restaurant managers started calling. Pillar Wage called Camden, Camden called Adrian, Adrian called the board called external counsel. External counsel called me. That call I answered. The attorney introduced herself as Lenora Pike, from a firm I knew by reputation. Calm voice, expensive silence. Ms. Hart, she said, I represent the independent directors of Vatrix Pay. I understand you are recovering, so I will be brief. Appreciated. We are trying to understand whether the continuity issue can be remediated without your direct involvement. Yes. How? By doing the work I documented before my termination. Do you believe current leadership understands that work? No. Do you believe Ms. Caldwell is qualified to certify the Havenford line? No. Do you believe the company was aware of the notification requirement before your termination? Yes. How? I told them in writing, multiple times. Silence. The expensive kind. Then she asked, would you be willing to provide a limited factual declaration to the board regarding your role, your warnings, and the transition materials you prepared? Yes, through my attorney. Another pause. Do you have counsel? Not yet. You may want to obtain counsel. I smiled. I had reached that conclusion. That evening, I contacted an employment attorney recommended by a former colleague. His name was Samuel Ortiz. He listened to the timeline and said, do not speak to them without me. I said, that has been the highlight of my week. He reviewed my termination paperwork, not the timing of my medical recovery, the severance offer, and the communications around authorization. Then he said, they're going to want you back temporarily. I know. Do you want to go back? No. Good. That makes negotiation cleaner. That was when the story stopped being about whether I would rescue Vatrix. It became about what Vatrix would have to admit before anyone could rescue the innocent people trapped under its leadership. By Monday morning, the company was no longer pretending. The emergency board meeting began at 7 a.m. By 7:40 a.m., Camden had blamed the situation on my uncooperative departure. By 7:52 a.m., legal produced my email warning Marianne not to submit the Havenford packet incomplete. By 8:05 a.m., someone asked why the named continuity officer had been terminated before the sponsor bank review without an approved replacement. By 8:09 a.m., Camden said the organization could not be held hostage by one employee. By 8:11 a.m., Adrian reportedly said, she was not holding us hostage. She was holding us upright. I wish I had been there for that. I would have slow-clapped from the back. At 9 a.m., the board appointed an independent operational review committee. At 9:30 a.m., Camden sent an all-hands email. Subject, operational update. It said Vatrix was experiencing a temporary partner review due to routine transition updates. It praised the team's resilience and asked employees not to speculate. Whenever a company asks employees not to speculate, it means the speculation is currently more accurate than the official email. By 10 a.m., my former team started texting me from personal phones. I did not answer operational questions, but I answered human ones. Eli wrote, are we going to lose our jobs? I replied, I don't know. Document your work. Do not sign anything you don't understand. Do not certify anything outside your authority. A junior analyst named Priya messaged, Bree asked me to backdate an exception note to Friday. Is that normal? My stomach dropped. I replied immediately, do not backdate anything. Write the actual date and time. If pressured, ask legal to confirm in writing. That was one of the moments people don't understand about revenge. Real revenge is not watching the whole building burn. Real revenge is making sure the interns know where the exits are. I told Samuel Ortiz about Priya's message. He told me not to engage further operationally, but said I could advise employees to follow policy and seek legal/HR guidance. So I did that. Again and again. Do not backdate. Do not approve outside your authority. Do not hide client issues. Do not alter audit trails. Do not sign Camden's panic. By noon, I heard from Dara Singh, the owner of a small vendor we used for manual account verification overflow. Dara's company had 12 employees. Vatrix owed them 2 months of invoices because finance had been optimizing cash timing, which is corporate for making small vendors act like unwilling lenders. Dara asked if she should keep staffing Vatrix work. I could not give business instructions, but I told her to review her contract, confirm outstanding invoices in writing, and avoid taking on expanded work without written payment assurances. She thanked me. 2 days later, I learned she paused new work and protected her payroll. Good. Let Camden's arrogance hit Camden, not Dara's employees. The biggest moral test came Wednesday. Pillar Wages' delayed payroll had created public complaints. Nothing viral yet, but enough noise that people were nervous. A Vatrix operations manager called me from a blocked number. I recognized his voice. His name was Jonas. He sounded terrified. Naomi, they want us to push the batch through the alternate route. I sat up too fast and regretted it immediately. What alternate route? The one through Northline. Northline was another sponsor bank relationship, but not approved for that client volume category. It could handle certain transaction types, not that high volume payroll flow without prior approval. Who is they? He hesitated. Camden. Of course. I closed my eyes. Jonas, I cannot advise you on company operations. I know, but I can say this. Do not process anything through a route that is not approved for that transaction type unless legal, compliance, and the sponsor bank authorize it in writing. They're saying it's temporary. Unauthorized is still unauthorized when it is temporary. His breathing shook. I don't want to be the reason people don't get paid. You won't be. The reason is leadership refusing to follow the approved path. Protect the workers by protecting the process. He whispered, Okay. Later, I learned Jonas refused to approve the alternate route without written authorization. And Camden called him not solution-oriented. Jonas forwarded that message to legal. Jonas survived the restructuring, Camden did not. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The public crack happened on Thursday afternoon. Not in a newspaper, not yet. In a client webinar. CivicNest had scheduled a routine implementation session with Vatrix and several municipal clients. Camden insisted on joining to reassure everyone. That was mistake number 17, if anyone was counting. A municipal finance director asked whether Vatrix's sponsor bank restriction could affect upcoming utility billing transactions. Camden smiled into the camera and said, We're not under restriction. We're simply enhancing our review posture. Unfortunately for Camden, New Havenford had sent CivicNest the restricted operational status notice directly under the disclosure clause. The finance director held up the notice on camera. I'm reading the bank's message. It says restricted operational status. There was a silence so complete you could hear reputations leaving the room. Camden said, That language is more technical than practical. A different client said, Technical language in banking is practical. That clip did not go viral, but it circulated among clients. By Friday, 3 major accounts requested risk calls. 1 paused expansion, 1 demanded fee concessions. 1 asked whether they could terminate for cause if restrictions continued. That was when Orion Ledger entered the story. Orion Ledger was a rival infrastructure company, not flashier than Vatrix, not louder, but stable. They had tried to hire me twice over the years. Both times I stayed because I was loyal, and because loyalty is a beautiful quality when you give it to people who do not confuse it with ownership. Their chief operating officer, Mara Ellison, called me Friday evening. Mara was one of those executives who asked short questions because she had already done the reading. I heard you're no longer with Vatrix, she said. News travels. In payments, restrictions travel faster. I'm not discussing Vatrix operations. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking whether you're free to talk about your future. I looked at the pill bottle on my table. the stack of medical papers, the severance agreement I had not signed, and the company phone I no longer had. My future is currently wearing slippers. That sounds recoverable. I liked her immediately. Namar did not offer me a job on that first call. Smart. She asked what kind of work I wanted next. I told her I was tired of being treated like an emergency service with a salary. I wanted authority equal to responsibility. I wanted operational decisions documented before sales promises. I wanted compliance involved before launch parties. I wanted junior staff protected from executive shortcuts. I wanted systems where no single person had to be the bridge, because leadership was too cheap or proud to build another one. Mara said, "That sounds like a mandate." It is. Good. We need one. The following Monday, Orion sent a formal proposal. Not employment. A consulting retainer first, limited and clean, approved through my attorney, unrelated to Vatrix confidential information. They wanted me to help design a continuity certification model for their expansion into high-volume payroll and lending infrastructure. 6-month engagement, board visibility, authority to build controls, budget for hiring, no emergency hero nonsense. Then, if both sides agreed, a permanent role, Vice President of Operational Integrity. The title made me laugh, not because it was funny, because someone finally named the thing I had been doing. Samuel reviewed the proposal. "Strong terms," he said. "I haven't made my demands yet." He paused. Then I heard amusement in his voice. "Excellent." My demands were simple. First, no use of Vatrix proprietary materials. Second, no client poaching initiated through me. Third, any employees Orion later hired from Vatrix had to come through proper channels, buying with clean employment reviews and no stolen documents. Fourth, the continuity model had to include deputies, not worship a single gatekeeper. Fifth, I would not be paraded as a revenge hire. Mara accepted all 5. Then she added a 6th. You get direct board access for risk escalations. I said, "You're making it hard to dislike you." She said, "I'm comfortable with that." While Orion was negotiating like adults, Vatrix was continuing its slow-motion collapse. Havenford escalated the matter to a formal shutdown review. That phrase sounds catastrophic, and in Fintech, it can be. It did not mean they were shutting Vatrix down immediately. It meant Havenford was reviewing whether the transaction line should be suspended, wound down, transferred, or allowed to continue under strict remediation. A shutdown review is what happens when a bank decides your risk is no longer theoretical. Camden tried to spin it as a strategic partner recalibration. The board did not appreciate that. Neither did Havenford. Neither did the insurance carrier. Neither did the clients who had actual money moving through the system, while Camden rearranged adjectives. At the same time, Samuel sent Vatrix a letter regarding my termination, the timing of my medical recovery, the ignored warnings, and the company's attempt to pressure me after revoking my authority. Suddenly, the severance offer improved. Dramatically. Funny how that happens when facts get their own letterhead. But I did not just want money. I wanted protection for the people still inside. So through counsel, I made conditions for any cooperation, not operational rescue. One not unauthorized certification, not Naomi, please come clean up the mess quietly so Camden can survive. Conditions. 1. Vatrix had to preserve all audit trails and employee communications related to the Havenford review. 2. No employee could be disciplined for refusing to backdate, alter, or certify records outside their authority. 3. All client-impacting processing delays had to be disclosed according to contract requirements. 4. Small vendors with outstanding invoices under a certain threshold had to be paid before executive retention bonuses. 5. Any temporary advisory help from me would go through counsel, be limited to factual explanation of historical processes, and require written confirmation from Havenford that they understood I was not certifying current operations. The board accepted. Camden did not. Which is why the final confrontation happened. It was in a conference room on the 23rd floor. I attended by video because I was still recovering and because I had learned that physical presence is overrated when your documentation is excellent. On the call were 2 independent directors, Adrian, Lenora Pike, Samuel Ortiz, Marianne, Camden, Bree, and me. Camden looked worse than the last time I saw him. Still expensive, less aerodynamic. Bree looked like she had not slept properly in a week. Marianne looked hollow. I did not enjoy that. I know people want these stories to be clean. Villains on one side. heroes on the other. But workplaces are messier than that. Marianne failed me. She also failed herself. She had known the truth and chosen comfort until comfort became impossible. Lenora began the meeting. Ms. Hart is here voluntarily for a limited factual discussion. She is not acting on behalf of Vatrix. She is not certifying any current controls. Questions will remain within the scope we agreed. Camden leaned back. Understood. He said it like a man who understood nothing. The first director asked me to explain my former role, so I did. Not emotionally, not dramatically. I walked them through the Havenford continuity requirement, the certification chain, the monthly control attestation, the reserve disclosure correction, the backup vendor dependency, the insurance overlap, and the risk of removing the named officer without approved transition. I explained how many times I had warned leadership. I referenced dates, emails, meetings, folders. The beautiful thing about being old school is that old school people keep records. No, Camden interrupted once. With respect, Naomi's view of the role is broader than leadership intended. I smiled. Leadership's intention does not amend signed agreements. One of the directors looked down, hiding a reaction. Camden said, "You created a perception of irreplaceability?" "No. I documented an actual dependency and repeatedly asked leadership to reduce it. That's not how it felt internally." I tilted my head. "Camden, feelings are not an authorization matrix." Bree closed her eyes. Adrian looked like he wanted to frame the sentence. Lenora redirected. "Mr. Rourke, please allow Ms. Hart to complete her explanation." I finished with the shutdown review. I said Havenford's response was predictable because the agreement had been designed precisely to prevent undocumented leadership changes from creating hidden transaction risk. More then, Camden finally said what he had probably wanted to say for 2 weeks. "You could have helped. Instead, you chose to send a notice that escalated everything." I looked at him through the screen. "I sent a required status notice after you terminated me, revoked my access, instructed me not to act, and proposed an unauthorized replacement. You knew what would happen. I knew what could happen if the company had ignored its obligations, which it had. You made us look unstable." "No, Camden, I made the instability visible." His face flushed. For a second, no one spoke. Then he said, quieter, "Do you want the company to fail?" That question surprised me, not because it was unfair, because beneath it, for the first time, he sounded afraid. I answered honestly, "No. I want the company to stop making innocent people pay for executive arrogance." Marianne began crying silently. Camden looked away. I continued. "Pillar wage workers did not fire me. Civic Nest clients did not ignore reserve disclosures. Dara's employees did not submit an incomplete review packet. My analysts did not create this. They have been carrying your shortcuts with their backs bent for months." I leaned closer to the camera. "You thought I was replaceable? Fine. Everyone is replaceable with planning, training, documentation, and respect. But you never planned. You never trained. You ignored the documentation. And you replaced respect with branding." Camden said nothing, so I gave him the line he had earned. "You thought I was a bottleneck. You never understood I was the reason the bottle still had a bottom." Adrian looked down at the table. One of the directors whispered, "Jesus." Lenora ended the meeting 5 minutes later. Camden was placed on administrative leave the next morning. Bree resigned 2 days after that. Marianne stayed long enough to help the remediation team and then left quietly. I don't hate her, but I don't trust her either. Both can be true. The shutdown review lasted 6 weeks. Vatrix survived, but not as the company Camden had promised investors. Havenford required strict remediation. The high-volume line remained restricted until Vatrix appointed an approved continuity officer, trained 2 deputies, corrected the reserve disclosures, rebuilt the authorization matrix, and submitted an external audit report. 3 clients left. R2 stayed after fee reductions. Civic Nest terminated expansion talks and moved part of its volume to Orion Ledger. No, I did not orchestrate that. They made their own decision after their CFO watched Camden redefine restriction on a webinar like a man arguing with a dictionary. The board forced a restructuring. Adrian returned as interim CEO, older and less loud than before. The company sold 1 division to raise cash. Executive bonuses were suspended, small vendors under the emergency threshold were paid. Employees who refused improper certifications were protected under the board's remediation policy. Jonas got promoted. Priya moved into compliance training and later sent me a message that said, "I still write the actual date and time on everything." I saved that message. Dara's vendor company survived. Pillar Wage received service credits and eventually migrated to a more stable processing model. Nobody clapped in slow motion. Nobody stood in the rain staring at a burning corporate logo. Real consequences are usually quieter. They happen in revised contracts, revoked titles, delayed bonuses, board minutes, resignation letters, and employees finally sleeping through the night because the adults have returned to the room. As for Camden, his departure announcement said he was leaving to pursue advisory opportunities. That is corporate language for please stop asking questions. His business magazine profile disappeared from the front page of his personal website. The neon all-hands photos were deleted. The bent paperclip logo stayed, unfortunately. Some punishments are eternal. My settlement with Vatrix was confidential. And so let's just say I recovered comfortably. Not yacht comfortably. But I can ignore LinkedIn recruiters with peace in my spirit comfortably. 3 months later, I joined Orion Ledger permanently as Vice President of Operational Integrity. My first act was not glamorous. I created a deputy certification program, 6 people, cross-trained, documented, tested, authorized, no single smoke alarm, no lonely bridge, no one person expected to quietly hold up a billion-dollar system while executives discovered synonyms for speed. At my first Orion board meeting, Mara introduced me by saying, "Naomi builds systems that survive leadership." I almost cried, not because it was sentimental, because it was accurate. And after years of being called careful, negative, legacy, difficult, and old school, accuracy felt like respect. A few weeks later, I visited Orion's operations floor. Not fancy, no neon, no DJ. Just people doing hard work with good tools and clear authority. A junior analyst asked me how I wanted exception reports labeled. I said, "Clearly." He laughed, then realized I wasn't joking. Good. The world does not need more clever reports. It needs clear ones. On my desk now, I keep a small paperweight Adrian sent me after the restructuring. It is shaped like a bridge. The note said, "You were right about the floor." I did not respond. Some messages are complete by themselves. Last I heard, Vatrix was smaller, quieter, and healthier. Adrian rebuilt slowly. The board stopped treating operations like a basement full of people saying no for entertainment. Havenford kept them on a shorter leash. Good. Some companies only learn risk management after risk manages them. And me? I still read contracts like thrillers. I still ask what happens when the workflow breaks. I still believe the most dangerous person in any company is not the loud executive with the microphone. It is the quiet professional who knows where the signatures are buried, where the deadlines are hidden, which clause has teeth, and how many invisible hands are keeping the whole machine from falling apart. They called me the settlement operations manager. I called myself the bridge. Then they fired me after surgery and tried to drive across anyway. Turns out, bridges do not have to collapse to prove they were holding weight. Sometimes, they simply stop pretending the cracks are normal.